Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me for the release of my recommended budget for the 2025-27 biennium. You know, when people are asked what they would do with $1 million, you often get extravagant or aspirational responses, which is predictable. I think the question, what would you do if you had an extra $100, is a more revealing question. What do you do when you have to prioritize and stretch resources as far as they will go to get the most in return? It's the answers to that question that we learn where our lines are drawn and what values rise to the top. In the months that my office worked with agencies to put together my 2025-27 recommended budget, we collectively grappled with setting priorities and focusing on the best returns. In a stark departure from my predecessors, I limited state agencies to a 1% increase in their proposed budgets, only 1% above current service level. And these proposals ultimately informed my final decisions. It was a hard exercise for some folks, but I believed and do believe that Oregonians in this moment would be better served by committing time and energy to practical considerations rather than well-meaning hypothetical wish lists. Developing my budget was an effort grounded in the reality of our state and our resources. I also asked state agencies to create 10% cut lists, and I asked them in making those lists, look at how we could protect supporting customer service, protect core services, and be strategic about where we have federal matching dollars that stretch the value of our state investments. Admittedly, this exercise was favored even less by folks. I do want to thank our state agency directors, all their staff, for digging deep and proposing difficult choices about how to prioritize Oregonians above all else in their budgets. So I want to thank them for that really good work. My approach to being your governor will always be grounded in truth, pragmatism, and a relentless pursuit of equitable outcomes for all Oregonians. The December revenue forecast projects stability for Oregon, and I'm pleased to share that my budget does not lay off people or cut services, and instead strategically deepens our commitment to building progress on Oregonians' top priorities, while remaining disciplined when it comes to new programs. My first budget as your governor, which was published within just 3 weeks of taking the job last year, was titled Mission Focused. Today, I'm here to make the case that being mission-focused in the form of executive actions, budget choices, and policy decisions since the start of my administration has shown concrete results, and that we must stay the course on what we see working. That's why this year my budget is entitled Building on Progress. Over the last 2 years, I've had the opportunity to travel to all 36 counties, visit Oregon's 9 federally recognized tribal nations, and continue the practice of consulting with the governor's Racial Justice Council. These conversations have helped inform my approach to decision-making and have strengthened my ability to be a governor for the whole state. I think leadership is about taking on big challenges. And such challenges, by their very nature, cannot be solved overnight. Real progress requires persistence. As I approach the halfway mark in my administration and take stock of where we have been and where we are going, I fundamentally believe that the legislature next year needs to pass budgets for the 2025-27 biennium that build on the progress that we have achieved together. So let's talk about the priorities in my budget. We'll begin with our housing and homelessness crisis. The numbers behind me are a snapshot of our current progress. As you'll see here, number of households rehoused, our shelter beds, preventing folks from experiencing homelessness, as well as our success in housing production. By the end of the current biennium, next July, the actions related to the homelessness emergency that I declared are projected to rehouse and shelter thousands of Oregonians, while preventing thousands more from experiencing homelessness in the first place. If we continue at this pace, the equivalent of nearly 1 in 3 Oregonians experiencing unsheltered homelessness on my first day in office will be rehoused by the end of my first term. My 25-27 budget stands firm and addressing our homelessness and housing crises concurrently. Continuing investments in shelter, rehousing, and prevention, as well as funding to build additional affordable homes, cutting red tape so housing projects can break ground faster, and support for first-time homebuyers are imperative to our steady progress. That is what it means to build on progress. Let's now turn to behavioral health. We know that in order to ensure that Oregonians have access to the health care they need across our state, we need to deploy a strategy where increased treatment capacity, that's more treatment beds, more facilities, open more hours of the day, works in tandem with increased workforce capacity. That's the number of qualified workforce to staff the treatment beds, the facilities, and fill shifts at all hours of the day. Just like we can't solve homelessness without building housing, we can't close our gaps in services without more places to get treatment and more people to provide that treatment. The state currently has a goal of an additional 465 treatment beds by the end of 2026, and my budget deepens this commitment with investments for another 363 treatment beds. Meanwhile, I'm renewing funds for the Oregon State Police to continue their enhanced fentanyl enforcement strategies and keep the drugs off of our streets as best we can. That is what it means to build on progress. So let's turn now to our children and our youth. For our youngest Oregonians, my education initiative has retooled the way school districts teach how to read through incentivizing evidence-based practices, updated current service level funding for the state school fund to make the state a more predictable funder of school districts, lessened disruption to learning through summer learning investments, and more. To reap the benefits of this progress, we need to stay the course and build on our commitment to public education. My recommended budget is not just about K-12. It also builds on the initiatives and expands our support outside of the classroom as well, in recognition that a good education is just one ingredient to the success of our children and youth. Improving access to youth behavioral health services, strengthening supports to address youth homelessness, and improvements to Oregon's child welfare systems are equally imperative to planting future success for our children. That's what it means to build on progress. You know, I mentioned at the start this key question: what do you do when you have to be strategic, prioritize, and stretch resources? My budget answers this question with 3 core goals that ultimately drove my decision-making. An Oregon where no one has to sleep outside, an Oregon where healthcare is there when you need it, an Oregon where the promise of every child is realized. And in these challenging times, an Oregon where we safeguard our values, including reproductive freedom, environmental standards, immigrant protections, and our civil liberties, regardless of the federal landscape. That's what we're made of as Oregonians. Neighbors who take care of one another, who reach for a helping hand when they need it, and who believe that a better future is possible. Since my first day in office as your governor, I have focused on taking urgent action on issues of top concern for Oregonians: housing and homelessness, behavioral health, and education. My 25-27 recommended budget is a direct reflection of my continued and steadfast commitment to making progress on Oregonians' priorities. As governor, I will always listen to Oregonians first and work to ensure my policy and budget decisions reflect an Oregon that welcomes everyone and is accountable to our shared values. Thank you. There's much information online, and now I'm more than happy to take your questions.
Governor, I didn't see anything in this budget about, thank you. I didn't see anything in this budget about transportation and transportation funding, which is supposedly a big thing for the legislature. Can you speak to what your plans are in that regard?
I can. Thank you for the question. There's more information in the larger book that is online, the larger full agency budget for the Oregon Department of Transportation. Here's what I will say. Legislature is involved. They've had public meetings over the past year. They are engaged in a process to figure that out. What you'll see in my budget is a marker of what I think we need to have a State Department of Transportation does the basic work of maintenance and preservation and safety, as well as meeting some other commitments that we have here in the state. The number that is in my budget is $1.75 billion. It is up to the legislature to figure out how to figure that out for the next biennium. But I think it was important to set a marker and continue to engage with legislators about how we solve that. And I will be engaged, my team will be engaged through the session on that.
Julia. So the longer budget has a line in here about retaining the rainy day fund and education stability fund at the level still achieved at the end of 23-25. Are you looking at possibly holding back money that would go into reserves at the end of this upcoming biennium to fund more?
I am. So the question about right now we have the practice of 1% set aside at the end of the biennium that goes into our 2 reserve funds. My budget does recommend diverting $150 million of that would normally go into the reserves to the Department of Forestry and the Office of the State Fire Marshal to enhance their ability to respond to wildfire season costs. It's only one-time money. We're obviously challenged right now of paying our bill for this season. It's not going to solve every problem, but I do think they need additional dollars, and that is a good way to spend, I think, the dollars for them to meet the crises that are coming at us on wildfire. If you look at some of the documents in my budget, we have a wildfire funding group that is trying to figure out how to make that type of resource sustainable. So I'm expecting that we will have a proposal in the session that talks about sustaining to not only do wildfire suppression, but to also talk about home hardening and the fuel reduction work that we need to see on the landscape. It is an unfinished product right now, but we need to have that conversation in the legislature. Any follow-up on that, Julia? Okay.
Hey, Governor. Well, just real quick on transportation. If I'm remembering right, 1.7 billion is a lot less than what ODOT has said it needs. Maybe I'm wrong, but it just sounds like you're just talking about maintenance and preservation. So are you accounting for like the Rose Quarter, the big mega projects that we know we need to finish? How are those figured in? And also, are there any other tax hikes or raises that you are assuming in this budget? I remember 2 years ago you said, actually we're planning on a 988 tax that's part of this, and that wasn't necessarily in the summary. Anything like that in this one?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dirk. So on the transportation package, it's $1.75 billion. It's a minimum number from my standpoint to meet our basic needs. Now, it is not, there are some very large numbers out there, particularly for some of our larger projects. The legislature is going to have to grapple with at least getting to that number, and then how they spend it will be the conversation. I don't think we can do anything less than that to have a functioning agency to meet the basic needs as well as do some of the project work that's out there. So that's the goal there. In terms of other revenue sources, I did build into my budget the assumption that the provider assessments that have been the way we have supported our Medicaid program for almost going on 20 years now, will be renewed and extended. So that is built into my budget, and we can get you more details on that.
Emily?
Governor, as you know, the largest school district in Oregon went on strike last year. It was really disruptive for students and families. Can you talk about how this adjustment to the state school fund in this budget will hopefully prevent more teachers from going on strike in the future?
I appreciate that question. Thank you. We've already seen that after the Portland teacher strike last year, when I have dug in on the current service level and the fact that you'll see in my budget, the current service level plus for our state school fund, I sat down with everyone and said, let's actually have a number that's more predictable and actually meets the basic funding needs of our schools. So because of that, I'm adding another $600 million into the state school fund that will provide that stability going forward. I'm not going to say it's everything, but it is significantly different than where we would have been if we had done nothing at all. I think that has sent a message to a lot of our districts that there will be resources in the next biennium for them. Not every school district is equally situated, but I've heard from a lot of our districts that they're like, this is really helpful, it'll help us meet our goals, and actually provide that has been lacking.
Yet the Albany School District failed to get an agreement last night. It broke down. Can you react to that?
Yeah.
situation?
Thank you for the question. Well, my team's been monitoring the situation with the Greater Albany School District. They are very close, is my understanding. And as many of these situations, it doesn't always come down to resources. This is a conversation about some other things at this point. And I'm hoping they will settle here soon. We need to get our school. I urge them to get back, to stay at the table and get it done so our kids can get back to the classroom.
Diane. Thank you. So you mentioned the goal of 36,000 units. Didn't quite meet that goal, it seems, the past couple years, and then you have millions more in this proposed budget going towards housing supply. I'm just kind of curious on what you think the proposed number or changes will do to meet that 36,000
Well, I think
goal.
I really appreciate that question. So you see in my budget, continued commitment on housing production. My quick answer to that is we have to continue to put everything on the table to solve that. And so you'll see that from me. Policy packages in the session about housing production, money in my budget, not only to create affordable housing, but to do infrastructure, $100 million to say we have to continue to do infrastructure to build housing. You know, you see the number here under what the legislature did this year. We have 25,000 units on the pipeline because of infrastructure. I put another $100 million in my budget to get more infrastructure also out there connected to housing. And you see in my budget also increase investments around home ownership, because this is about the whole continuum of housing to help people move into home ownership, get more housing built, make it more affordable, make it easier to build, faster to build. There's investments in my budget for the Housing Accountability and Production Office, the HAPO office, which would be providing technical assistance as well as holding our local governments accountable to meet the moment with what is in the books right now that they can do to be more flexible on the ground for construction. So we have to do all of it. That's what I can say. I'm going to try all of it. I'm going to put as many resources as we can and as much streamlining as we can. And I need the partnership of the legislature to actually continue to make progress there.
Remote question.
From Amelia with OPB, how much does your budget allocate to close the Medicaid funding gap? And can you explain how the gap developed?
Well, in terms of thank you for the question. In terms of the Medicaid funding gap, we have been successful here in Oregon of keeping people insured on the Oregon Health Plan. I think we're one of the most successful states post-pandemic to keep people enrolled, because that does keep everyone healthier, and it does keep overall costs in the system down when people are insured. And we have people staying on, and costs are continuing to rise, and that created some gap. The proposal in my budget around the provider assessment, where insurers and hospitals come together to help pay for the Medicaid program, that gap should be filled. And hopefully the legislature will agree with that. I would like to see an early session budget on the provider assessment to just be clear that we have solved that issue for the health plan.
Before I go into the second round, anyone that hasn't asked a question, I haven't heard from Abby or Anastasia. Okay, second round, Julia, go ahead.
Beyond the $2.5 million that you want to set aside for disruptions in reproductive health care, is there anything else your budget is planning for possible reductions in federal funding to Oregon in the next biennium?
I do think there are concerns out there that funding streams that all states have counted on, not just Oregon, might be, changed under the new administration. I don't think we know what the answer to that question is yet. We're trying to take an inventory of what some of those programs could be. They tend to be more direct grant programs that can be up and down depending on an administration. I do know that a lot of things that we do here are also important for states across the country. For example, how we fund Medicaid and why that's important. So I think it's a wait and see on that. The good thing about here in Oregon, we'll have 6 months to see what's coming out of the new administration next year. There'll be a session the following year, and we'll just have to adjust as we go. Again, my goal with my budget, knowing that there could be changes, was to focus on the things we need and stay focused there. But we're going to have to be flexible if things are changing at the national level.
Governor, what policy proposals will you propose in the legislature to back up your budget? And I'm particularly interested if you will have anything regarding PERS, because some of the school districts, particularly Salem-Kaiser, say that any increase will simply go into paying their PERS costs.
I will not have any legislation for this session on PERS adjustments. The adjustments we made in 2019 are continuing to work their way through the system. My budget does include, I think, $89 million for the adjustment in PERS rates for the districts on top of the adjustments in the current service level of the state school fund. So I feel I'm being responsive there. It's also true that some districts are going to have to manage their own challenge there. Some districts don't have problems right now with PERS, others do, so it is not consistent across all school districts. In terms of policy proposals, we're working on a housing production framework bill, no surprise. We're working on mental housing. So we're continuing to work on housing production policy proposals. We'll be working with the legislature to further standardize the system that we're building on serving folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So there'll be some work on that. And I'll continue to make sure we are investing in the things we started with last year, early literacy, summer. So again, I think what I would say about my policy proposals and anything in this budget, there's no surprises here. These are the priorities I've talked about since day one. I'm going to continue to talk about them. We need to stay the course. I think sometimes I worry they'd be like, oh, we did that, we should move on. It's like, we're not done. We're making progress. We have to stay with the key priorities and the key investments that make them happen.
Nigel from Willamette Week asks, OHCS recently released a report that showed population growth really outpaced housing development for the past 2 decades. What's your reaction to that? And when do you think Oregonians will see meaningful progress on of 36,000 new units annually?
Well, I hope to have a more of a presentation on housing production goals in the new year, so I'll just preview that. We don't have that today. As it relates to population growth, what we saw in the forecast is we continue to have population growth in Oregon. We just don't have the size of the population increases that we were seeing over the last couple decades. We've kind of leveled out. That will have some impact on the amount of production that we need, but very little. I mean, we still need more units. We are very short. I'm going to share one anecdote. I was in Astoria last Monday, and I went out to Astoria, to Clatsop County, because when I declared my emergency order last year, they were one of the places in the state that had very high levels of unsheltered homelessness. At the beginning of last year, they had 0 24/7 shelter beds. None. They had some bad weather sheltering if needed, but they didn't have any 24/7. They now have 80 shelter beds in their community, both in Astoria and Seaside. I met with a guy who had lost his housing, no-cause eviction, single parent, 2 kids, who can work, wants to pay his rent, he wants to be out of the shelter. He's sheltered, which is good. He's in a Project Turnkey site, but he now needs a place to go. So for me, housing production, we can stabilize the system, and we have done a great job of stabilizing how we help folks who are unsheltered, and it is now a statewide system for the first time with statewide commitment, and that's a good thing. But what is the next bet, and where we need to be really doubling down, is where does that single parent with his 2 kids go when he wants to find housing? He needs an affordable place to live in the community that he's chosen, and we're going to have to do more in production. So I will be focusing on production heavily as we sustain the system that is helping people right now. It's not an either-or conversation. You need both.
You mentioned no service cuts. Was the recent revenue forecast just so bullish that we didn't have to shed any blood anywhere, or are there some meaningful cuts that you would want to point out at some place in here? And just a sort of a companion question is, it looks like quite a bit more money for housing and homelessness than I saw, at least in your last proposal. That doesn't always mean more results, right? Because costs roll up, things get way more expensive. So do you expect pace to increase, or an increase in deliverables, I guess would be the word, with this expenditure?
Well, we'll continue, and as I have been, asking for the outcomes connected with the dollars, particularly under the emergency order. So I will stay on that. It's like, when a community is receiving funds, how many shelter beds do you have? How many can you sustain? How do people, get, eviction assistance, prevention, and as well as rehousing? So those goals stay in place. What you see in the budget, Because of what happened last year with the early session package and the final session, there were a lot of moving parts of what we were actually doing to support our providers and communities who are serving the unsheltered neighbors. And so the numbers that you see in my budget committee, more than $700 million, that is a continuation. I am sure there's some folks in the state we should be spending more, even though that is a lot of money. That sustains what we've built. That says you can keep those beds open, you can keep your staff. It doesn't necessarily grow, and in fact, I don't think it grows any new beds. It just sustains the ones we have, which is really, really important. So we have built a baseline of support, and we need to maintain that. I do think legislators are like, why would we still be spending that kind of money on this? This is what it costs because the crisis is so deep, and we need to build housing. So we don't have to grow the system. Because everybody still sees folks living outside. We need to continue to do shelter and get the back door to work better, which is getting more housing on the ground. I think you had a different question too, but.
I think you answered it.
Okay.
Unless there's specific cuts you want to point to.
Yeah, the way I would characterize the budget, we are maintaining what the state is doing well. I think we see very modest growth considered what we've been in the previous biennium. The one-time dollars from the pandemic are are on their way out the door. So I think it's a stability budget building on the stuff that we know works. I was trying to rack my brain if there were a bunch of new programs in here. There's some nuances of things that we are enhancing and doing a little different, but I would be hard-pressed to say that there's actually 100% new. There might be a program new in state police because it's not a pilot. They're trying to do more going after fentanyl distributors. But it's normally you see governors like, here's my list of new stuff. We're not talking new folks. We're talking about staying the course on the stuff that works.
Remote question. Sammy Edge with the Oregonian. What do you make of what must be disappointing statewide housing permitting numbers at a time when you're trying to boost building?
Well, Sammy, what I'd say is I'm never satisfied. We have more to do there. I'm glad we now have a new director of our Housing Accountability and Production Office. There are dollars in my budget to continue the momentum of saying, hey, local government, what can we do to help you speed up what you're doing? And you'll see that also in my production policy bill as well. And I want to thank our local governments. They're working really hard. My job is to make it easier for them to do their job, to get housing sited, to get it in the pipeline, because when you are building housing, time is money. We need to do it faster and more efficiently.
Governor, this one's on Oregon's economy and our largest private employer, Intel. Layoffs announced earlier this year in the fall, and Pat Gelsinger now out as the CEO. I know you worked with him to try and grow this industry. What can you say about that? What are your concerns here?
Well, I will say, from my understanding is, as of last week, the federal government did ink the deal for CHIPS and Science Act money from the federal government coming to Intel, which means they will continue forward on their expansion on their campus out in Washington County. So that is good. We are going to continue to be a very strong sector here in semiconductor manufacturing. The money from the state's CHIPS Act is been moved out the door. We have folks who are expanding. And the semiconductor industry, I think, continues to be up and down, and I think you're seeing that a little bit with Intel. But it'll continue to be a very important part of our economy. I continue to be bullish on advanced manufacturing in the semiconductor industry here in Oregon. We are solid. Intel might have some ups and downs, but they have stayed committed to Oregon, and I think they'll be here for a while. You know, I wish him well. I mean, I'm sure it's a pretty stressful job. What I've seen in Intel over the years is, and you see this in major companies, right? When a leader steps back, they pivot, bring new people in. I think Intel has a good core of leaders, and I wish him well. And also, I think Intel will be just fine.
Remote question. Ken Body at Coin, with the federal emphasis on rolling back DEI programs and major companies scaling back their diversity efforts, what effect could that have on the state's racial justice efforts?
Well, thank you for the question. Here in Oregon, and we have put into statute now the Governor's Racial Justice Council, which I meet with on a regular basis. Internally for the state, we are continuing to make sure we have equitable outcomes in procurement and hiring and the types of things, and creating a workplace where everybody feels part of the workforce. I think one of the things that people forget on diversity, equity, inclusion is the final word, which is belonging. When we support workplaces for everyone, we're going to do our best job. And I think Oregon will stay committed to that regardless of what happens at the national level. And the Racial Justice Council will continue to keep issues in front of me in terms of the investments we're making, maintaining the investments we're making as a state, to make sure we're supporting equity across the board. We don't want to miss a beat here, and I can't predict what will happen from the national standpoint, but Oregon is going to stay the course, and we're going to do everything we can to keep the course going forward, because I think we're doing good work, and we are changing the debate and dialogue about what it means to be an Oregonian and how we can be a place where everyone has opportunity.
Anyone but Dirk have a question? Let's do Diane. And then Dirk.
Yeah, I was just curious. It was kind of highlighted, I can't remember the exact number, but increases to implement fully the employment-related daycare program, which I know now still has a wait list. And I was just kind of curious how your budget kind of addresses kind of the growth versus, or the need versus the reality for that program specifically, with highlights on education and childcare.
Thank you. I've been a strong champion of the employment-related daycare program even before I was governor. And in my budget, we will maintain the current participation, and we don't want to lose anyone who's currently getting support. I also will be very honest, because I need to be honest with folks. Expanding that program will be very challenging at the moment, so I think we want to maintain the program we have, because I think it's a program that's working for families. That's why you see a wait list. In past years, it was a program that people would cycle on and off of because it really didn't work for them. It is working better. People are staying on longer. That has made a budget challenge for us. So I think the legislature is going to have to take up, well, how else could we do more? In my budget, you see, sustaining the people who are getting served now without an expansion.
It looks like you have $1 million a year to DOJ to expand attorney resources. I think explicitly it seems to maybe sue the Trump administration, but can you talk about that money and what do we get for $1 million a year for the DOJ?
Well, one of the things I noticed thank you for the question, when I was Speaker of the House and during the first Trump administration, then, current Attorney General Rosenblum, was very focused on doing a lot of work. So I knew that they might need additional resources because a lot of challenges will come our way based on current federal regulation. So I think $1 million a year to help the incoming Attorney General have additional resources is important. You'll also see in my budget money to enhance our responsiveness on the bias hotline that runs out of the Department of Justice. I have heard from a lot of folks since the election, worried about their safety, worried about who is going to respond if they feel unsafe in their communities. And so it made sense to make sure the Department of Justice has some more resources to respond and really look at what the patterns are, if there are patterns coming in through the hotline, to address that. So that's why we put resources there.
But do you know, is it 3 attorneys or something? Do you know what $1 million pays for? Make it real for me. Do you have that sense?
Well, I think some part of the challenge is, we had the election. We didn't even know who the incoming Attorney General would be. I wanted to make sure there's a placeholder for him to have a conversation in the budget process, because with the transition, we don't have the specifics, but now he's like, there is some money there. It'll be up to him to come in with some specifics based on those resources to have that conversation with legislative budget leaders.
Governor, what are you going to be doing to build support in the legislature, particularly with the minority party, for your budget? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Republicans say they weren't involved in the decisions for how the wildfire funding would be addressed in the special session.
Yes. Well, with regard to working with all legislators, I'm an open door. I will be working with all legislators, regardless of party, particularly if we have shared interests. For example, I look forward to working with Senator Anderson on housing again. We did so last year. I've been working with leaders on the Republican side on education. They've been involved in our work groups all summer long around current service level. So there's a lot of opportunities to work with legislators, regardless of party, on issues that we all share as being important. As it relates to the special session, what I will say about that is my conversations were with the presiding officers, the Senate President, and the Speaker of the House, as the co-chairs of the emergency board, trying to, is it an emergency board? Is it going to be a special session? It is good to know that legislative leaders, have consensus that the best way to pay our bill is to have a short special session to focus solely on the firefighting bill. And I don't think that's a partisan issue. And I look forward to a successful session because we need to pay our bill.
Going back to Dick's first question about transportation funding, that it sounds like you're leaving a lot of those decisions up to the legislature. Are there other areas that you can identify for us where you might want the legislature to do more of the heavy lifting on figuring out parts of the budget?
Well, I will say that the legislature does make the budgetary, I recommend they will allocate. That being said, we're going to be heavily engaged on the big topics. I convened a group over the summer to talk about the provider assessment, so we'll be coming in with a proposal for the Medicaid funding. We will definitely be engaging on the transportation package conversation. The wildfire funding group, my staff has been leading that. That was a budget note from the legislature in February to say you should have a group that gets together to talk about wildfire program funding. Our office has been leading that. We will be having conversations in the legislature with legislators around that. So I think suffice it to say, for those big items, transportation, wildfire funding, Medicaid funding, we will be heavily engaged with legislators as well as on the priorities in the budget. They need to be involved. They need to make the final decisions, and we'll all be working together. There's a lot to do.
Seeing none others, Dirk?
There's I think $140 million. The term is reinvested ARPA money, and I just don't know that. Is that unused stimulus money? Can you help me understand where this $140 million?
Oh, on the behavioral health side?
Correct, sorry.
It calls
Yes.
that out. Yes, it does. Kate, do you want to answer that question? So Kate Nass is our Chief Financial Officer who's with us today. The only reason because with the ARPA money, it has to be spent by a certain time, but I'm not sure, I don't know if you want to speak to that more directly.
Thanks for bringing me up here. Appreciate it. So there's a couple of components that are happening on the ARPA. There's funding where the ARPA funding had to be obligated by the end of this calendar year. But then we have until 2026 to spend it. So it's carrying over and just maintaining that expenditure limitation. There's also some projects that we started with ARPA money and we're continuing. So residential behavioral health is one of those where we are investing states money to continue building out residential behavioral health capacity that is kind of continuing what we've already done. So without looking at the context of your 140, I wanted to, it could be either way.
I think it was both staffing, like helping the workforce pipeline and building new beds.
So that's the second point I made. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And I think it's important, and why we called that out in the documents is, it is about setting expectations about what you have for ongoing money. This is money that, once it is completely used, doesn't just pop up again in the budget. But it is important, particularly on the one time on the capacity and the workforce. I think we have a crisis that we need to spend money on. It makes sense to use those additional one-time dollars. But this is true. I mean, I think the biggest challenge when you're doing the budgeting is what the expectations are of, there was a lot of one-time money spent in the last 2 biennia because of the pandemic. We're finally, I think, in this next biennium, 25-27, will be the first time where we can actually, those things will have played themselves out to most degrees. So this will be like, what is sustainable? What can we do biennium after biennium with our current resources? Which is why, going back to my earlier comments, I really wanted agencies to think about, you have your current service needs, and there's a budget, and I want to support that. But don't go more than 1% above that, because our expenses and our revenue have to be matched up, and we are continuing to be challenged. I think you see other states who have a real mismatch. I'm trying to stay aligned with the expenses of the priorities and the resources we have, and I think people have gotten a little used to a lot of one-time money that could pay for things. That is not the case anymore. And so we need to be sustainable. And so that's what this budget is about, sustainable on the priorities that actually matter.
From KPTV, in light of firefighters still waiting for payment for the past wildfire season, how is your budget prioritizing making sure that the crews that were contracted get their money on time?
Thank you for that question. Well, I'm committed to paying our bills. If you recall from the announcement last week, our total cost of 24 wildfire seasons is about $350 million. It'll take about 2 or 3 years for the federal government to pay a good chunk of that. So we have to pay our bills now. The special session in this current biennium will handle the fire costs that are currently in our system to pay all the bills by the end of the year, assuming we have a successful special session. So it is not reflected in my budget, other than to say, for the next 2 years, we should set aside some money for the next fire season, but we're going to pay all of our bills with that special session.
Have you had a chance to talk with Republican leader-elect Drazen yet? And how are you thinking about working with her and when she's back in a leadership role in the House, given your history?
I appreciate that question. It has been my practice to meet every month. I had standing meetings with both Republican leaders, and I will continue that. I texted her when it was announced she'd be the incoming leader. I look forward to her being sworn in next year. I mean, it's unusual to have someone come in to be leader who's not even sworn in yet. But I reached out to her and said, look forward to working with you. We're going to get that on the calendar, same with Senator Bonham. My goal is I have regular meetings with our Republican leaders, and they're very open-ended. Everybody brings their ideas to the table. So some of them are in person, some are virtual. You know, it's really up to them, but I will continue doing that.
I'll have more time if you want it. Anything else?
Well, if there are any follow-up, let us know. I just really appreciate, once you start digging into the longer book and the short book, I'm sure you're gonna, you will have questions. But again, this is a starting point for the budget process. I'm really encouraging Oregonians and lawmakers to be focused on the things we need to fund, and look forward to the upcoming session. Oh, Dick, you have a question?
Governor, you talked about having to make choices. What isn't in the budget that you wish was?
I think it's the topic of wildfire and resilience. So if you go to the appendix, which is unusual, we don't usually have appendices in the little book here that we put together to highlight the parts of the budget. Natural disaster readiness is really important. And, I would like to see the legislature support the $150 million to be set aside for future wildfire suppression. But you'll see in that appendix, we need every 2 years another $130 million sustainable to do the home hardening, to protect our communities, to do the fuel reduction. What we saw in this wildfire season, and I heard it from folks out and most of it was in Eastern Oregon, they're like, when I had the ability to prepare my land for fuel reduction, you saw less burn. You can see like side-by-side communities who were able to do more prep work or hardened communities, how much more successful they were compared to those who were not. We did some, when Senate Bill 762 was passed with the Wildfire Policy Council in 2021, there were some significant investments there. We need to get back to that. That will be, right now we're talking about $130 million per biennium. It's not in my budget. We need to get a funding source for that. You'll also see in that document where I would really like to do another $10 million for our community resilience hubs, the hubs that actually provide materials and resources and training communities when a disaster does strike. We are not funding resilience and climate adaptation for our communities enough. So hopefully there's going to be an add-on of at least another $140 million from the legislature on top of my budget that will get to that, because that is not in there right now.
Any fun questions? We usually rely on Dick Hughes for that. All right, adjourned.
All right. Thank you, everyone. It's good to see you all, and I will hopefully see you at the Business Summit next Monday. So thank you all.